the one and only Noel Bernal.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you guys? Andres mentioned there would be 300 plus people. So in my mind, I'm imagining a crowd. So this room is full in my mind. But for those that are not here, I hope that virtually the message will get out there. And for those that are here, I really hope that there's something that y'all take away from this speech. But in working with Andres here the last year, one of the things that I've learned about Andres is that he says bold things because he's a big picture guy and he says what he believes and what he means. So in full disclosure, same thing with me. I'll make some statements as part of the presentation. Those statements are totally mine. But part of what I want to do today is really help challenge the thinking. A lot of that is what we've been doing in Brownsville, I would say, the last almost 3 years. Should I take this off? Okay. There we go. So that's what I'll do. And a quick introduction. My name is Noel Bernal. I have been serving in city management, city government for just over 10 years, primarily as a city manager, city administrator in small cities, assistant or deputy city manager. I've traversed the state of Texas, from South Texas, small cities, to Taylor, just outside of here, to the northeast of Austin, and then Capel in the Metroplex, and then back to Brownsville, where I started. Interestingly, I began in one of the smallest cities in the region of about 2,500, and now I am in one of the largest city at almost 200,000 population. So as of this past census, we're just over 185,000. So that's a bit about me. I would say that in sticking with the theme of the presentation, I took a bit of an S-curve in my career. And I want to credit one of my mentors here, Bert Lumbreras, who will be on the panel. But he challenged my thinking when I went through a Texas City Management Fellowship program back in 2011, when he asked me, so you want to be a city manager, what's your 5-year plan? And how are you going to get there? And I was thinking in a very linear way. I was an intern in a city in South Texas. I was thinking I'll become an economic development analyst, I'll become a manager, assistant director, ACM, and that'll be a 10, 15-year plan. Well, that was truncated when he challenged me of, have you ever thought about going to a small city? I was a city administrator in Dilley, Texas at 21 years old. I still didn't have my bachelor's degree. Well, at the beginning of my MPA, I applied to a small city and did the same at 25 years old at the city of La Villa. So that was quite an S-curve for my career. But let me talk Brownsville. The Brownsville S-curve. Brownsville is the largest city in the Rio Grande Valley, an area now of almost 1.5 million people. It's the largest city down there. If you all follow Elon Musk or SpaceX, you've heard about Boca Chica. Boca Chica is not a city. Boca Chica is the local beach where Brownsville residents go to. That's the non-South Padre Island beach. What I want to talk about today is what's going on in Brownsville. And in the panel, my deputy city manager will be joining me, and I want to leave her with some of the projects and some of the tactics that she can go over in more detail. What I want to talk about is more so the thinking, the strategy, and the approach. What were the challenges? What were the opportunities? And what are we doing down there that is helping us do some of the things that are going on down there? So the Brownsville S-curve is the best way that I could define what message I'm trying to convey today. I'm a conceptual guy, but I'm also a big fan of mental models. Without mental models, I don't know how I would navigate this world. So the S-curve is a mental model to help deliver today's message. So this is called, next slide please. This is called the S-curve of innovation. Brownsville, Texas has some tremendous challenges. When I looked at this community and they were looking for a city manager after the prior one had been there for over 15 years. If you look at Brownsville from afar, you would almost say, why would you want to go in there with the challenges that it has? Quite dire. It's among the top 5 most disconnected cities from a high-speed internet connectivity standpoint. So we're one of the poster childs for the pandemic when it came down to lack of broadband. We're amongst the poorest cities in the country. We're about 50% under the national median. Income levels So basically, when you go through some of these indicators, it kind of begins to compound, and it all makes sense as to why income levels lead to higher rates of food insecurity. It has a compounding effect on other socioeconomic challenges. We struggle with some lifestyle issues with higher incidence of diabetes, educational attainment, et cetera. Those are the challenges. At the same time, those are the opportunities. Before my start with Brownsville in late 2018, there were already some pretty tremendous things going on down there to tackle these very issues. The UT School of Public Health, which has its main branch in Houston, was already working with the largest Hispanic cohort, diabetes cohort of over 5,000 people through a longitudinal study and changing the built environment through a trail system, through lifestyle coaching, et cetera. And they have that cohort has since plateaued, and now it's declining, whereas Texas diabetes levels are continuing to increase. So something is going right when it comes to how we're approaching our issues with health. However, there were still more things to tackle. When you look at Brownsville, and this is where I helped the commission contextualize a bit more, because when I got there, SpaceX was beginning to ramp up, and there was all these concerns and excitement even about the future growth, and the growth is coming, and the growth is coming. So I challenged him, what do you mean by growth? What kind of growth? How fast are we going to grow? What's the rate of growth that we're going to be experiencing? Have we set up the systems in place to support the growth? On and on and on. So just to give you some context, so Brownsville is a top 25 city in Texas based on population, but if you begin to examine our tax base and look at the metrics that as a city manager you begin to examine, we're at about 3.5 to 4 times, we have 3.5 to 4 times less wealth than some of our other top 25 cities. So North Texas alone has, I think, half of those top 10 cities. So if you look at Frisco, if you look at McKinney, they're about 185, 200,000 population, but they're at 25, 30 billion in tax base. We're at 7.9 billion going into fiscal year 2022. So we have to do more with less. Our service levels are leaner. Our access to funding for infrastructure is less. Our tax rate was riding a little bit higher as a result. And when you look at these challenges, one of the things I explained to the commission is, have you all looked at the fiscalization of your land use? How are you growing? What makes up your tax base? We conducted a study. This is part of where we began to set the context. And what the commission learned was, or council, was that 73% of our tax base is residential. And when you look at our income levels, that equates to a housing price point of about 100,000. So 73% residential tax base is not a good balance to have. We had 19% commercial, which serves the rooftops, and about 5% industrial. A lot of our industrial is in the port of Brownsville, which is outside of city limits. We don't get to tax that. It's not part of our tax base. So we began to study the challenges and how do we begin to change course and tackle these issues. So we talked about how do we build a sustainable future, fiscally sustainable future, and what is the role of technology? What does the digital future hold for Brownsville? So those are some of the opportunities, and just want to kind of juxtapose some of that. Next slide, please. So ultimately, from my perspective, what I told the commission when I interviewed, the first priority was going to be working on building a new culture for the organization. One that also impacted how we interacted with the governing body and how we interacted with the community, because that culture ultimately needs to tackle major issues. If we're going to take on these issues, not just potholes and brush pickup and stray dogs, I'm talking about the stuff that I just covered, it's going to take a new type of thinking and a new strategy. So the S-curve, for those of you all in the room, there's some technologists in here, I'm not a technologist, but it's my way of wrapping my head around explaining our approach. Technology, innovation, et cetera, the S-curve framework is not a new concept. It's been around since the 1990s. It was coined by Charles Handy. It's a way of describing the way at times technology has a slow start, then it hits an inflection point and it just grows and hits this peak, and then it kind of stabilizes and it tapers and then on to the next curve, and you can continually have new S-curves that follow. But if you look at Brownsville's growth, we were growing about 2 or 3%. I mentioned some of our tax-based challenges. If we were to create the tax base that we needed to tackle our infrastructure issues, our service levels from a per capita standpoint are very low. That equates back to the wealth disparity that we have. If I was to look at and tell the commission, how do we tackle that in the linear thinking way of incremental growth? It's a 20-year plan. By the time your tax base catches up to, by the time your 8 billion becomes 16 billion or 30 billion, it's 20, 30 years. SpaceX was ramping up, was beginning to launch rockets, blow up rockets. I told the commission, one of the things that we don't have here is the luxury of time. Because SpaceX first showed up in Brownsville 2013, 2012. They did all the environmental. You know, we're wired to have to see things to believe it first in local government. We're many times risk averse to a fault. Well, we were still waiting for them to start launching rockets before preparing the community for what SpaceX's impact was going to be. But SpaceX also represented an opportunity for us. So the life cycle thinking of city planning is typically 25 years plus the development cycle. We had to find a way to truncate that. And whether we were able to do it or not is not the issue. The thinking had to change. Okay, you don't have the luxury to grow at 2 to 3% over the next 20 years. We need to grow more exponentially. And that doesn't mean you have to be running around with your hair on fire and in a chaotic environment. No, it can be a very strategic, methodical approach. But our approach to growth from a tax-based perspective, our approach to innovation and the role of innovation had to shift from incremental to exponential, or from the linear traditional to the S-curve approach. The thinking had to change. Let's just get the thinking right, and then we can kind of go into the tactics. So I'm applying this concept in the context of our community's planning towards smart city development and toward tackling the very issues that I just mentioned. How do you get out of the top 5 most disconnected list? It's going to take bold actions and big picture thinking. Bottom line, there's no other way. If not, wait 20 years. Or, for example, if you look at East Asia, the way they tackle their big issues is they take a 100, 500-year planning horizon. That's how they look at urban planning. When they make their capital investments, they think with a 100, 500-year approach. That's their approach. Well, what I told the commission is we have to think in S-curves. We have to think a little bit different. When the pandemic hit, it accelerated trends that were already going on. Nothing new really was discovered. Existing trends were just magnified. Government, cities, at times elected officials, our community members, we need to help change that thinking and cultivate the right thinking, because in the era of quantum computing, technology doesn't work in a linear way. And it's not the fault of city managers, elected officials, or community members. The issue is that most organic life forms follow the near linear path. So we're more comfortable with a very gradual growth, whereas we're now living in an era of exponential growth. And the investments and the developments that we're making do not necessarily always follow a linear growth path. If you tell somebody 1 + 1 = 10, they're going to tell you you're wrong. It's not correct from a math perspective. But you're challenging their thinking, because many times some of our technology investments are going to have that 1 + 1 = 10 effect. And that's the thinking in Brownsville. We can't afford to think 1 + 1 = 2. If we think that way, it's a losing game for Brownsville. At the bottom of the S-curve at times, it can feel that there's nothing going on. But as you're developing and cultivating, once things pick up and you hit that tipping point and that inflection point, at times you just hit these spurts. In Brownsville, some of the strategic decisions that we're making and investments we're making, from 2 to 3% growth, the last 2 years we've had 6% growth, just over 6%. This year is 5.48%. So even from the last 3 years to the prior 10 years, it's grown a bit. They've felt what it feels like to have more discretionary money in the budget to do some stuff. It feels different, but we have done things, and they're beginning to connect the dots, that it's their thinking that leads to their capital investments, or their CIP decisions, their budget decisions that are paying off already. Next slide, please. So here's that S-curve, being bold and thinking big. So here's a question that I could ask the commission or a community member or my planning director or my transportation director. How would we sustainably support 1 million people in 5 years? We're under 200,000 right now. What would Brownsville need to be doing now to support 1 million people in 5 years? It doesn't matter whether I'm technically right or not, or whether that forecast pans out or not. That's not the point. We need to stretch the thinking so that we re-engineer, work backwards, and make different decisions today if we want to make S-curve impacts in Brownsville. So what we're doing is we're leveraging the innovation and leadership capital of our elected officials and organization to become the regional capital of the Rio Grande Valley. If you look at the Rio Grande Valley, McAllen has a great reputation. They've done some great things. I know their city manager who was there for a long, long time. They've had great elected officials, but Brownsville is the largest city. It's a little bit of an anomaly because Brownsville is the biggest city. They have these tremendous assets, the largest land port, et cetera, but they couldn't quite kind of figure it out. Right now, we're at that bottom launch point. If you were to ask me, where is Brownsville pinpointed on this S-curve, I would say we're right there at that first launch point in the bottom. We're at this taking off stage. How do we there's a culture change, and I'm not gonna go into that, but let me just stay here a bit more. When we started hiring our executive team, you have Helen here, she'll talk, our deputy city manager. She came over from the city of Hutto. One of the biggest things that I was looking for is not just the technical skills, but it's how they think. And when we began to look at our culture development process, we hired an outside facilitator. We began to focus on our culture. What are the values? What are the behaviors? Where are we going? We used the value disciplines model. Some of y'all may be familiar, but there's 5 major strategic planning frameworks out there. We use the value disciplines model. We wanted to really focus in on our value proposition so that we could understand how to make S-curve type investments and decisions. The value disciplines model was done in the early 90s. Y'all may be familiar with basically the premise is there's 3 disciplines. You have to choose one and be really good at it. One is called customer intimacy. Think Chick-fil-A, think Southwest. One's called operational excellence, think Toyota. And the other one is called product leadership, think Nike, think Apple. But there's an application to cities. There's a new book or an update to that came out. And the update was for applying the digital lens in the 21st century context. And we studied that book, and the book's called Digital Disciplines, Attaining Market Leadership via the Cloud, Big Data, Social, Mobile, and the Internet of Things. And it took those 3 disciplines and it updated them. So operational excellence became information excellence. Customer intimacy became collective intimacy. Product leadership became solution leadership. And then it added a 4th discipline or a 4th dimension, and that is accelerated innovation. And the reason is because these disciplines in a digital environment work in an exponential way. And that goes back to the S-curve. When you start investing in some of these decisions, certainly you want to look for the efficiencies, you want to look for the reduction of cost, increased productivity, absolutely. But you could also be creating market-leading strategies that deliver more citizen value, that tackle your most core issues like some of what we have in Brownsville. So it's next generation investments and mega programs that we could start to look at versus just, again, the traditional linear approach. Here are some use cases. Most disconnected. Before the pandemic, this is in late 2019, we began in February 2019 with a community summit of all the anchor institutions, the key stakeholders. We began to study. We each put in some seed money to fund a feasibility study. By the time the pandemic happened, we were already studying. It was a broadband feasibility and digital inclusion plan. That was on the ground as of December 2019. When the pandemic happened, it just validated that we were on the right path. So while some cities are still developing their broadband plans, we're working with CMG. We're about weeks away from selecting a vendor. We want to break ground in October on a middle mile network. We're not going to go last mile. That can be a whole different case study, but we're beginning to create the environment for digitization, one of the 3 mega trends that CMG talks about. Digitalization, decentralization, decarbonization. Well, if you're one of the least connected cities, what are you thinking about bells and whistles and gadgets if your foundation is flawed? You need to invest in broadband. We were going to use our CIP. We restructured our debt portfolio back in 2019. The commission supported one of those S-curve decisions. I challenged them. They were floating all their debt in 15-year bonds, which is more typical of a wealthy city. I said, why do you put so much pressure on your debt service tax rate? We can do 20-year, 30-year debt if you align it with the useful life of the asset. They understood it. We walked them through a study. We restructured our entire portfolio, created automatically $30 million of new infrastructure financing. Then on those 6% years of growth, it gave us 20 more million. So now we had $50 more million of capital improvement dollars. And we just added another 20 million because of the growth for this third year. $70 million that did not exist before by re-engineering our debt portfolio, but we needed the resources to invest in ourselves. That's where we were going to invest in broadband, but then ARP comes, and what do? Let's save our money and, of course, use the $65.2 million that we received from ARP. We're taking 20 million to fund our middle mile plan. We'll then do a P3 to get a partner that can take it to the end user, to our citizens. We don't believe it's in our best interest to be a provider of broadband, but we do seek to provide the backbone, the long haul, and then get a last mile partner. That's a game-changing decision for Brownsville. We're not going to be on that top 5% anymore. We're also at the airport. We have a brand new airport where we have our first solar photovoltaic electric generation and battery storage facility. We're beginning to do stuff on the green energy side. We're beginning to create our own grid system. We own our own electric system, which is what's going to help us with the middle mile, but we're also doing other things on the energy side to make us more sustainable for the long haul. We brought CMG on board to help us create a smart city roadmap. We didn't want to be making these one-off decisions. We wanted to start cohesively, strategically investing in the community, starting with broadband and building from there. One of the things that we're doing within the organization is our finance department will be using artificial intelligence, a software called Abby. We did this in my prior community to begin to automate accounts payable, accounts receivable, saving us about 2.5 accountants worth of work. It'll communicate with our ERP system. We'll be the first city in the Rio Grande Valley to use artificial intelligence, one of the first in the state, because many in the state have not used machine learning yet within their organization. Others include broadband, traffic signals. Believe it or not, we still had timers. We did not have a traffic synchronization system. That's being implemented now. Smart parking meters, believe it or not, we still had the clunky old mechanical downtown meters. Those are going away, already funded. I talked about the accounts payable. Telehealth, we're working on a telehealth case study. The Methodist Health System of San Antonio gave us a grant to start to use the broadband system to create a telehealth case study down in Brownsville and start to pilot there. And then our Brownsville Public Utilities just made a decision to cash fund an AMI system for water and electric meters. So we're building here, but it's part of a more cohesive plan. I really can't go into all that detail. Perhaps Helen can talk on that during the panel. Also, so we're creating this ecosystem for digitization, but also the new space economy is something that we've staked our claim very early on. The new space economy, the commercialization of space, or SpaceX is considered the NASA of the private sector, basically. That's at the early part of the S-curve. If you look at where it's projected to be by 2030, 2040, the space economy is going to be about $3 trillion worth. That's the market capitalization projected. To give you a rough magnitude, oil and gas right now is about 3 trillion. So space is going to be 3 trillion. We in Brownsville are capitalizing on SpaceX being there to build an ecosystem around it. We call it New Space City, Brownsville. And we're making strategic investments. I'll talk about what we're doing out there at our airport as well. But ultimately, we're creating the ecosystem. We brought in a company out of New York who is bringing in the venture capital to seed fund space companies. The company's called Space Ventures. Space Channel, they're the Golf Channel version for the space. They moved from LA to Brownsville to broadcast from Brownsville, all the space activity going on beyond Brownsville, but they'll be located there. We built a nonprofit that's taking the educational, the workforce development side off the ground called Expanding Frontiers. And then Paragon recently joined, and he'll be speaking later on today. but it's a drone technology company that is disrupting the future of transportation and mobility. If you were to ask me, or if you were to look at Brownsville 3 years ago, and if you read the papers and talk about, we just had an article come out that we'll have 50 vertical takeoff and landing urban air taxis by 2025. If you were to ask me that decision will be made by a Paragon type company 3 years ago, it would make no sense. Based on the fundamentals that I just walked you through, why would they invest in Brownsville? If you talk to Dwight, he sees the vision, he sees the environment, he sees the investments that we're making, and he's believing in Brownsville and investing in Brownsville now and saying, I want to help disrupt and do the proof of concept for the future of drone technologies in Brownsville. We're talking about the future of air rights, the future of air mobility, the future of innovation zones. How do the ordinance structure the entire regulatory framework? How does that work? It doesn't exist. In our proposal, we have what are called resakas, or these oxbow lakes that traverse the city. That's actually what we used as our way to say, you can deliver mail medicine products to households using our resaka system. There's no need to even get on roads in Brownsville. A different way to look at how to use drone technology in a safer way. Elon Musk is investing in Brownsville. So Dwight Smith, the Paragon founder, the chief visionary officer, is investing in Brownsville, and so is Elon Musk. $10 million. He sees the millennials, that's his employee base. Our downtown is also revitalizing. I didn't speak to that today. Our downtown's turned a corner, and we're building mixed-use development, more sustainable development, reinvesting in our dense grid system downtown, urban core, and that's what he wants to do too. Giving us $10 million, the Musk Foundation gave us $10 million, and we're coupling that with our ARP fund to replace the old water lines, old sewer lines, electrical, upsize, continue to build densely so that we can not just sprawl and be unsustainable long-term. Our airport, this is our brand new airport terminal. Our old one was functionally obsolete. It did not support the future growth needs of the aerospace industry in Brownsville, notwithstanding the business growth that we're talking about, but it had the potential, $70 million investment. It opened in December 2020, on time, on budget during the pandemic, but we've changed it. So our airport was just catching up to where it needed to be because our other regional airports, next slide. Oh, did I shift? I'm sorry, next slide. I've been going through all these different slides. Next slide. My apologies, next slide. Next slide. There we go. My apologies. So we're no longer looking at this just from an airport perspective. It's now an air and space campus. There's been additional acreage that's been purchased. There's undeveloped land. We're now also there are less than 10 space ports or publicly owned spaceports. So SpaceX is a commercial spaceport for vertical deep space launching. You also have what are called horizontal spaceports for non-deep space. And we have funded a feasibility study in early 2019. We're now applying for the actual spaceport designation license. So we won't just be an airport now. We'll be the Brownsville Air and Spaceport. A company called Javiation is who's working through the FAA process. So now we're going to incubate companies that can manufacture, build, launch from our airport. Not just, we want to recruit more airlines, but also benefiting more from that new space economy. And even from the VTOL economy. So our mobility plan, the city of Brownsville was one of 3 MPOs down in South Texas. The decision, next slide please, the decision to consolidate was overdue. That immediately unlocked $1 billion of more federal funding for our region. And that's fantastic, but one of the things it exposed is that Brownsville did not have an intra-network mobility plan. And because we have 5 modes of transportation, we have rail, we have highway, we have the land port, we have space, we have air. We wanted to capitalize and create an innovative, smart mobility plan. And now with Paragon in Brownsville, we are focusing on bypassing traditional transportation modes and jumping straight to VTOL technology. There's been some discussion by legislators in the Valley about a rail system. et cetera, et cetera. Well, we can just bypass rail. We don't need to make that major capital investment and dedicate sales tax, and we can just go straight to VTOL technology and skip 20 years or however long it would take to get a rail system. The key part is manufacturing hub in Brownsville, tremendous presence. They'll be one of our anchors at the air and space port. Next slide, please. So in closing, what I would say here, because I know Helen will talk more about the tactics. Helen can talk more about how we're operationalizing this further, talk a bit more on the specific projects. I didn't want to be too tactical this morning. What I wanted to talk about is Brownsville's on an S-curve, a very intentional S-curve. We're early on. We see Paragon's decision to choose Brownsville making sense in an S-curve thinking mentality, not in a linear mentality. There was no way that in 3 years we could have had our fundamentals in a position where you would say Brownsville could rival Frisco, for example. But what we've done so far and the vision we've painted and the decisions that we're making in a very strategic, intentional way can put us in a position and give us that seat at the table to compete for the Paragons of the world. Why are we joining Cedar? We're joining Cedar to accelerate the creation of the new space economy in Brownsville and in Texas. Texas does not, outside of Houston, there isn't a new space economy, the commercialization of space. Houston is the government-funded version. We're talking about the commercially funded version. Brownsville will be that place for Texas. We're coming to Cedar to benefit from the resources, but also to be a contributor and to bring down resources to the Rio Grande Valley, to the university down there as well. Ultimately, Texas is that Texas triangle that we've come to know. Why not it be a Texas arrow? There's a TxDOT official he had a map that called it the Texas arrow. Well, if we create enough GDP in action to give people a reason, it's not that difficult to draw a line and make it a Texas arrow versus just a Texas triangle. But it's going to take S-curve thinking decisions that Brownsville and our regional leaders have to make for that to occur. And that concludes my Smart City presentation. Look forward to questions, and I know Helen will be up here joining me with some of the questions. So thank you so much.